My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm 36. 4 days before my sister-in-law's wedding, I was standing behind a wall of white hydrangeas at the reception venue, holding a clipboard I didn't actually need, when I heard my mother-in-law's voice on the phone with the calligrapher. "Don't put her on the family table," she said. "She's not really family, she just married in. I don't need her name floating around like she belongs there." She wasn't talking about a stranger. She was talking about me. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, not even my husband, not fully, was that 11 years before that sentence left her mouth, I had bought that property myself. My father's life insurance check. My name on the deed. Not Daniel's. Not the venue's tidy little management companies. Mine, quietly, the entire time. Before I tell you what happened 4 days later, at 4:52 in the afternoon, in front of 200 wedding guests, tell me, what time is it where you are right now, and where are you watching from? I always wonder how far a story like this travels. My father, Thomas Whitfield, died when I was 22. Congestive heart failure, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, in an Ohio January so cold the cemetery crew had to break the ground with a jackhammer before they could bury him. He left me 2 things, a life insurance payout of $61,000, and a note, folded into quarters, tucked inside the tackle box he used to take me fishing with when I was 9. Buy something that can't be taken from you. Land doesn't lie about who owns it. I've read that note more times than I could count. I married Daniel Ashworth 6 years later. I loved him. I still do. But I married into a family that had a very specific idea of what belonging looked like, and I never quite fit the shape of it. My mother-in-law, Margaret Ashworth, ran that family the way some women run an exclusive hotel, gracious to guests, immaculate on the surface, and quietly, precisely unwilling to let certain people feel too at home. She had 2 biological children, Daniel and his younger sister Whitney, and then there was me, orbiting the edge of a family that had already finished deciding who belonged in the center of it before I ever arrived. Margaret never raised her voice at me. That wasn't her style. Her cruelty came in smaller denominations, spread out over a decade, each one too minor on its own to complain about, without sounding ungrateful. At our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, I was seated at the far end of the table, past the children's chairs, next to a space heater that hadn't worked since the Obama administration. At Daniel's 40th birthday party, a party I planned, budgeted, and ran from start to finish, the banner over the fireplace read, "Celebrating our son." Not our son and daughter-in-law, just our son. I stood under that banner for 4 hours handing people plates of food I'd cooked. For 6 Christmases in a row, my gift from Margaret was a candle. Always a candle. Never wrapped in the same paper as everyone else's gifts either. Mine came in plain craft paper, tied with plain string, because you're not sentimental about that sort of thing, she told me once, smiling like she'd paid me a compliment. She introduced me at parties, consistently, for 10 years, as Daniel's wife. Not Claire, a job title standing in for a name. At Whitney's college graduation, the family portrait included Daniel, Margaret, Whitney, and Margaret's sister, 4 people arranged carefully on the lawn. And someone, without asking, handed me the camera. And at my own baby shower, 3 years into the marriage, before we lost the pregnancy at 19 weeks, Margaret spent the afternoon telling guests how excited she was to be a real grandmother, finally, when Whitney has kids. I was sitting in the room, 7 months pregnant at the time. Small cuts don't need a knife. There's a 6th one I still think about more than the others, small as it is. The year I turned 30, Margaret hosted a just family dinner for Whitney's birthday, 2 weeks after mine had passed with nothing more than a text message. I found out about the dinner because Daniel mentioned it in passing, assuming I already knew, assuming I'd been invited the way he had. I hadn't been. When I asked him about it later, gently, not wanting to start anything, he looked genuinely confused, like the gap had never once occurred to him, because he'd never had to notice it. That's the part nobody warns you about going into a family like this one. It isn't only the mother-in-law. It's the years of nobody else registering the pattern, because the pattern was never aimed at them. I never once brought any of it to Daniel as a formal complaint. I filed it away instead, the way you file paperwork you assume you'll need someday, and quietly hope you never do. Whitney, meanwhile, was the golden thread running through every family story ever told at that table. Whitney's art show, Whitney's promotion, Whitney's engagement to Grant Sullivan, whose family owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties, and, as Margaret liked to remind anyone within earshot, understood what real family investment looked like. I had a role in that family too, just never a named one. I was the person who remembered everyone's allergies before Margaret hosted a dinner. The person who drove 2 hours to sit with her after her hip surgery, while Whitney was too busy with the gallery opening to come. The person whose competence got quietly assumed, and just as quietly unacknowledged, year after year, the way a light switch gets used 1,000 times before anyone stops to think about the wiring behind the wall. Reliable, invisible, useful in the way furniture is useful, present, functional, and never once asked what it thought about the room. I kept my own history quiet through all of it, partly out of grief. My father's note felt too private to hand over as a party anecdote to people who'd never meet him, and partly because I had learned, slowly and expensively, that in the Ashworth family, anything I built on my own would eventually be measured against everything I hadn't been born into. So I never told them about the barn. The barn was a genuine wreck when I bought it. 11 acres outside of Millbrook, a collapsing dairy barn with half its roof open to the sky, a farmhouse with no working plumbing, and a view of the valley that made even jaded real estate agents lower their voices, like they'd walked into a church by accident. I paid $540,000 for it, every cent of my father's money, plus a loan I spent 4 years paying down, while working nights as a bookkeeper for a trucking company that smelled permanently of diesel. I didn't buy it to impress anyone. I bought it because my father told me to, from inside a tackle box, after he was already gone. Over 9 years, I restored it board by board, reclaimed oak beams, sourced from a demolished mill 2 towns over, a stone fireplace I helped rebuild by hand, blistering both palms in the process. I registered the property under an LLC, Larkspur Holdings, and hired a management company, Reyes Hospitality Group, to run it as a wedding and event venue, specifically so my own name never had to appear on a single brochure, invoice, or website. Today, it nets close to $310,000 a year. I never told Daniel's family a word of it. I barely told Daniel the full financial picture, not out of secrecy between us, but because the barn had been mine before it was ever ours. And some things you protect the way you protect a scar, you don't feel like explaining at dinner parties. Then Whitney got engaged to Grant, and Margaret began touring venues like she was casting a movie. She wanted somewhere that said old money, somewhere with real bones, somewhere that would make the Sullivans understand the Ashworths weren't a family to be condescended to. I watched 3 months of increasingly frantic group texts unfold. Venue quotes, budget arguments, a $40,000 estimate from a converted vineyard that made Whitney cry openly at Sunday dinner, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. I offered to help. Quietly, through Reyes Hospitality, I arranged for Larkspur Barn to be secured for Whitney's wedding at a steep, unexplained discount, $12,000 instead of the standard $40,000. I told Margaret I'd found a connection through a coworker. A lie, but a generous one. The only kind of lie I've ever felt good about telling. I wanted, for once in 11 years, to be the reason something good happened to this family, instead of the person who was tolerated at the edges of it. I wanted to earn the chair at the table, instead of being seated by whoever decided I deserved one. For a few weeks, it actually worked. Margaret called the venue an absolute miracle. Whitney cried happy tears this time, the good kind, holding both my hands across the kitchen table and telling me I'd saved the whole wedding. For the first time since I'd married into that family, I let myself believe something had actually shifted, that maybe 11 years of small denominations had finally been overdrawn, and something warmer was about to replace them. At the bridal shower, held in Margaret's backyard under a rented tent, I sat at a folding table near the gift display, listening to a toast Margaret gave about the people who make a wedding possible. She thanked the caterer by name. She thanked Grant's mother for her generosity. She thanked, at length, a florist who had given them a modest 10% discount. She did not mention the barn, or who had secured it, or why the price had come down by 70%. I sat there in a folding chair holding a mimosa I never finished, doing quiet arithmetic on how much of myself I was willing to keep erasing before I stopped calling it generosity and started calling it what it actually was. Then, slowly, almost too gradually to notice at first, the story began to change shape underneath me. By the engagement party, Margaret was telling guests that Grant's family had connections that got them the venue. By the bridal shower, 6 weeks later, it had solidified further. The Sullivans really came through for this wedding, didn't they? Such generous people. My $28,000 gift, the difference between what they were paying and what the venue actually cost, had been quietly and completely reassigned to a family that had contributed nothing to it, but a phone call I had invented myself to cover my own tracks. I had disappeared inside my own generosity. The erasure kept collecting small evidence of itself, the way water finds its own level without anyone deciding it should. Whitney's wedding website, which I helped Elena build in a single afternoon over video call, went live with a special thanks section crediting Grant's incredible family for making the dream venue possible. My name appeared nowhere on the page. Margaret posted a photo of the barn to her own social media with the caption, "So grateful for the Sullivans' generosity. Some families really do show up for each other." 41 people liked it, including, I noticed, my own husband, who hadn't read the caption closely enough to catch what it was quietly doing to me. At the final tasting, a caterer asked, casually, whose idea the venue had been, and Margaret answered before anyone else could. "Oh, that was all Grant's parents. They know people." I stood 4 feet away, holding a fork, and said nothing, because saying something would have required explaining a lie I'd told to protect a version of generosity that was already being taken away from me, piece by piece. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I hadn't done it for credit, and mostly, that was true. But then I saw the seating chart draft for the rehearsal dinner, forwarded to me by accident by a cousin who didn't realize I wasn't supposed to see it yet. Grant's parents were seated at the head table, beside Whitney and Grant. Daniel and I were listed 3 tables back, under a header that simply read, "Additional guests." $28,000, and I was an additional guest at my own sister-in-law's wedding, in a barn I had rebuilt with my own hands. 4 days before the wedding, I drove out to Larkspur for a final walkthrough with the wedding planner, Elena Voss, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd worked with for years through Reyes Hospitality, though the family only ever knew her as the coordinator, never as someone who took her instructions directly from me. I arrived early, before Elena, before the caterers. I was behind the hydrangea hedge near the tent entrance, checking the reception floor plan on my phone, when I heard Margaret's voice carrying across the gravel. She was on a call with the calligrapher, finalizing the last of the place cards. "No, take her off the family table," Margaret was saying, brisk, unbothered, the way you'd correct a typo. "Put her with the Sullivans' cousins somewhere. She's not really family, she just married in. I don't need her name floating around the head table like she belongs there." I didn't move. I didn't step out from behind the hedge. I just opened the voice memo app on my phone, a habit left over from years of documenting vendor calls for the business, and let it record the last 40 seconds of that call. That night, sitting in my car in the venue's own gravel parking lot, I called Marisol Feng, with the real estate attorney who had handled the original Larkspur closing 11 years earlier and had managed the LLC's annual filings ever since. "You don't have to prove you belong to anyone," Marisol told me, her voice flat and certain over the phone, the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who has read 1,000 deeds and never once seen one lie. Paper remembers what people conveniently forget. I wrote that down on the back of a receipt. We didn't plan anything loud. No confrontation scheduled, no dramatic phone call to Margaret, no scene rehearsed in a mirror. Marisol simply pulled the original deed, the LLC formation documents, and the current lease agreement between Larkspur Holdings and Reyes Hospitality Group, and put them in a folder. I asked Elena Voss, who had known for years that I owned the property, because she'd signed every vendor contract directly with my LLC, To simply be present at the final walkthrough with that folder in her bag, in case anyone asked a question she couldn't ethically dodge. No shouting, no sabotage, just facts, documents, and timing. Marisol asked me one question before we hung up that night, and it's the question I keep coming back to, even now. Do you want her to apologize, Claire? Or do you just want the truth to exist somewhere she can't argue with it? I didn't have an answer right away. Sitting in that gravel lot, engine off, hands cold on the steering wheel, I realized I'd stopped expecting the apology sometime around Christmas number 4, the year of the 4th identical candle. What I wanted, it turned out, was simpler and harder to admit out loud. I wanted the paperwork to finally outrank the story Margaret had been telling about me for a decade. I wanted one Saturday afternoon where the facts were louder than her version of them. I didn't sleep much over the next 3 nights. I kept the voice memo backed up in 2 places. I kept Marisol's folder in my car, then moved it to my office, then back to my car again, the way you handle something you're both afraid to lose and afraid to be caught holding. Daniel noticed I was distracted that week and asked twice if something was wrong. Both times I told him I was just tired from wedding logistics. It wasn't entirely a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth, and I remember thinking, somewhat bitterly, that I'd spent 11 years absorbing everyone else's half-truths in that family. I could afford to sit with one of my own for 4 more days. The wedding was held at Larkspur Barn on a Saturday in late September, the oak beams strung with warm string lights, 200 folding chairs facing a stone fireplace I had rebuilt with my own blistered hands 9 years earlier, back when nobody in that family knew my name well enough to leave it off a guest list. At 4:52 p.m., during the final vendor walkthrough before the ceremony, Margaret approached Elena with a complaint about the table linens. The same complaint, more or less, she'd been circling for a week, sharp and precise, the kind of critique designed less to fix a problem, and more to remind everyone whose wedding, whose family, whose standards this really was. I don't understand why we're paying for a venue that can't even get the linens right, Margaret said, loud enough for a small cluster of bridesmaids nearby to hear every word. Honestly, whoever's managing this place should know better by now. Elena, calm as ever, opened the folder in her hands. I can pull the vendor agreement for you, if you'd like to see who's actually responsible for the linens. She flipped to the signature page. It's a personal service clause, tied directly to the property owner. Would you like her contact information? She's right over there. The room had to lean in to hear what happened next. Margaret looked where Elena was pointing, at me. Claire doesn't own this place, Margaret said, half laughing, the way people laugh when they're still deciding whether something is a joke or the end of the world. She just knows the manager, or something. Elena didn't blink. Claire is Larkspur Holdings LLC. She's owned this property for 11 years. I've been sending my invoices to her business account since I started booking weddings here. Whitney, standing nearby in her wedding dress, one shoe already off, went very still. Wait, she said, her voice thin. Claire, you own the barn? The whole barn? I walked over. My hands were shaking. My voice wasn't. I bought it with my father's life insurance money when I was 25, I said, years before I married into this family. And I arranged the discount on your venue myself, Whitney. Not the Sullivans. Me. $28,000 of it came straight out of my own pocket, and I let everyone believe it came from somewhere else, because I thought that would finally be enough. A cousin near the back, someone I barely knew, one of Grant's relatives, a woman in a pale blue dress I'd spoken maybe 4 sentences to in my life, asked the question that would end up quoted at 3 separate family gatherings over the following year. Wait, why is her name on the deed, and not yours, Margaret? Margaret's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do in 10 years of marriage into that family. It went blank, then red, then something close to frightened. I never said she wasn't welcome, Margaret said too fast, the words tripping slightly over each other. You said I wasn't really family, I said, quietly. Not a shout, just the sentence handed back to her, exactly the way she'd given it to me 4 days earlier, behind a hedge she hadn't known I was standing behind. You said it to a calligrapher, about your own son's wife, 4 days before I let your daughter get married, on land I paid for with money my dead father left me. Daniel, who I hadn't warned, because I didn't trust myself not to lose my nerve if I saw his face beforehand, stepped up beside me. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at his mother, then at the barn around us, the beams, the fireplace, the whole structure, like he was watching 11 years of Sunday dinners rearrange themselves inside his head in real time. "Mom," he finally said, his voice low, careful, final. "She built this. All of it. With her own hands, with her own money, before she even knew us. And you've spent a decade telling people she doesn't belong at the table she's been quietly paying for the whole time." Margaret's hands went to the string of pearls at her throat, the same gesture I'd watched her make at every family crisis for 11 years. Funerals, arguments, the night Whitney announced she was moving in with Grant before the engagement. It was the gesture of a woman reaching for something solid to hold on to, and finding, for once, that nothing in her hands could argue her out of what 200 people had just watched happen in real time. "I didn't know it was hers," she said, weakly, to no one in particular, as if not knowing were the same thing as not having said it. "You didn't need to know whose it was," I said, "to decide I wasn't really family. That part, you'd already decided a long time before this venue existed." Somewhere near the dessert table, someone set down a plate too hard. It cracked against the table edge, a small, sharp sound that seemed enormous in a room that had gone almost entirely silent. At 5:03 p.m., 11 minutes into the silence that followed, Margaret tried once more to recover the room. "This is a lot of drama for a Saturday," she said, forcing a laugh that landed on no one. "Can we please focus on the wedding?" But the wedding planner was still holding the folder open, and Grant's mother had gone very quiet beside her husband, doing the math on 3 months of dinner party bragging in real time, her face going through the same sequence Margaret's had a minute earlier. Blank, then red, then something closer to sick. "You told everyone it was us," Grant's mother finally said to Margaret, quietly, almost to herself. "You told the entire guest list it was our gift." Margaret didn't answer that one at all. Whitney crossed the tent in her wedding dress, mud already climbing the hem, and threw both arms around me. "I didn't know," she whispered into my shoulder. "God, Claire, I swear I didn't know." At 5:14 p.m., 22 minutes after Margaret first complained about the linens, the ceremony began anyway, because Whitney insisted, because the officiant was already in position, because 200 seated guests are a very hard thing to uninvite from a moment already in motion. I sat in the front row, not with the additional guests, with the family, for the first time in 11 years, without having to ask. The story didn't stay inside that tent. By Sunday morning, 3 different guests had already posted about it. Vaguely, carefully, the way people do when they know they witnessed something they weren't technically supposed to repeat, but can't quite help repeating anyway. One post read simply, "Wedding drama at my cousin's venue yesterday. Turns out the daughter-in-law nobody talks about owns the whole property. Mill's face. I will never, ever forget it." Margaret's book club, a group of 12 women she'd curated over 15 years, around a shared appreciation for propriety and pearl earrings, went quiet on her for nearly a month. One member later told Whitney, with a little too much satisfaction in her voice, that Margaret had always talked about Claire like she'd married beneath the family, and it turns out Claire owns half of Millbrook, and never said a word. Margaret's first response, when Daniel confronted her the following Sunday, was a version of an apology built entirely out of scaffolding and no actual walls. "I never meant it the way it sounded. Everyone knows how I feel about Claire, deep down. I think this whole thing is being blown a bit out of proportion. It satisfied no one, least of all Whitney, who had spent part of her own wedding night crying in a bathroom stall, instead of dancing her first dance as a married woman, because her mother had turned the day into a referendum on someone else's worth. Grant's parents, the Sullivans, who had, in reality, contributed nothing at all to the venue, and had been quietly, happily taking credit for a gift that was never theirs for 3 straight months, found themselves publicly and permanently corrected in front of their own extended family. It strained their relationship with Margaret for the better part of the following year, an outcome I hadn't aimed for and honestly hadn't thought about at all, until I watched Grant's mother's face crumble in real time. She hadn't done anything except believe a story Margaret handed her, gift-wrapped, months earlier. In that moment she looked like a woman realizing she'd been used as a prop in someone else's cruelty, and I felt something for her I hadn't expected to feel for anyone in that tent besides myself. I felt sorry for her. I still do, if I'm honest. Daniel's relationship with his mother changed in a way that surprised me more than any of the rest of it. For the first time in the 11 years I'd known him, he stopped smoothing things over on her behalf. When she called him 3 days after the wedding, wanting to explain the misunderstanding further, he told her, evenly, that he needed a few weeks before he could talk about it without saying something he'd regret. It was the first boundary I had ever watched him set with her, and I remember standing in our kitchen listening to his half of that call, thinking that whatever else this had cost, it had also finally shown him something he'd spent a decade politely not looking at directly. Elena Voss, for her part, told me afterward that 2 other clients had specifically requested her for their own weddings after hearing, secondhand, the story about the venue owner. She hadn't repeated a word of it herself. She didn't need to. Some rooms simply generate their own weather. I didn't feel triumphant, watching all of it unfold. I want to be honest about that, because I think the version of this story people expect is the one where I feel triumphant, and that version simply isn't true. I felt clean. I felt tired. Not relief, exactly. Freedom. The kind that arrives with a cost you're still totaling up months later, at odd hours, for no reason at all. 6 weeks after the wedding, Margaret sent a card. Not an apology. Not really. Just a card. A single pressed flower tucked inside, and the words, "Thinking of you?" In her looping, careful handwriting. Daniel called it a start. I called it a candle dressed up in nicer paper. At Christmas that year, for the first time in 7 years, my gift from Margaret wasn't a candle. It was a gift card to a hardware store, an oddly specific, oddly accurate acknowledgement of 9 years spent rebuilding a barn with my own hands, the closest thing to a real apology she'd managed yet, filtered entirely through an object instead of a sentence. I still have the receipt. I haven't used it. I'm not sure yet whether that's spite or just patience. 8 months later, Whitney showed up at my office unannounced, still in her work clothes, and asked if we could talk for a few minutes. She apologized. Plainly, without ornamentation, the way I had needed someone in that family to apologize to me for over a decade and never quite gotten. I was wrong, she said, sitting across from my desk, turning her wedding ring around her finger like a habit she hadn't broken yet. Not just about the venue, about letting Mom's version of you become my version of you, for years, without ever checking it against anything real. I should have checked. I never did. Margaret and I have not fully repaired anything, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one tend to get told with a bow on top far too often, and it does a real disservice to anyone actually living through something like it. We are civil now. She uses my name instead of Daniel's wife, has, consistently, for the better part of a year. She came to Thanksgiving and sat 2 seats down from me, instead of at the far end by the space heater that finally, after 11 years, got fixed. It is not warmth, exactly. It is architecture, the frame of a relationship rebuilt without the illusion that the old walls were ever load-bearing to begin with. I used part of last year's venue profit, $85,000 of it, to start a small program through Larkspur Barn, offering free wedding venue access, 4 times a year, to young widows and widowers marrying a second time. People who, like me at 25, had inherited grief instead of a safety net, and needed somewhere solid to build something that couldn't quietly be taken from them by anyone else's version of the story. I named it the Whitfield Fund, after my father. The first couple who used it, a widower named Roland marrying a widow named Patrice, both in their 50s, both burying a first spouse before finding each other again, asked me why the venue was free. I told them, briefly, about a note in a tackle box, and about 11 years of being introduced as somebody's wife instead of a name. Roland just nodded, like he understood the shape of that story without needing the rest of it filled in. Patrice cried a little, standing in the farmhouse office, looking at the framed note on the wall. "Land doesn't lie about who owns it," she read aloud, quietly, and then looked at me and said, "Neither do people, eventually. It just takes some of them longer to stop lying to themselves first." I think about that more than I expected to. Last month, I found his note again, the one from the tackle box, the one about land not lying about who owns it. I had it framed, finally, after carrying it folded in my wallet for 14 years. It hangs now in the farmhouse office at Larkspur, beside a photograph of the barn on the day I bought it, half the roof open to the sky, and a photograph of it as it looks now, oak beams glowing warm under string lights on somebody else's wedding day. Revenge, in my case, was never really the goal, even when it looked that way from the outside. It turned out to be something closer to a structure collapsing beam by beam, not all at once, not in an explosion, just years of small, unacknowledged weight finally giving way to the plain, boring, undeniable truth of what had actually been load-bearing underneath it the entire time. I used to think proving I belonged meant becoming more useful, more generous, more agreeable, until eventually, someone noticed and handed me a seat. What the barn taught me, slowly, over 11 years of quiet ownership nobody knew about, is that belonging was never actually mine to earn, from people who'd already decided the shape of it without me in the room. It was mine to build, on 11 acres my father paid for with the last money he ever made, whether anyone put my name on the family list or not. Here's what I've learned, watching my own story from the far side of it now. The people who tell you that you're not really family are very often the people who benefit most from you quietly believing them. Not because you aren't enough, because your quiet is convenient for them, and it always has been. Documentation isn't cold, it isn't cruel, even when it feels that way in the moment you finally reach for it. It's just the truth, waiting patiently in a folder, for someone to finally ask it the right question out loud. Would you have stayed behind that hedge, or would you have walked out from it sooner than I did? If you've ever been the additional guest in your own family, the one who gives and still gets seated by the broken space heater anyway, tell me about it in the comments below. Type boundary at family or justice, whichever one actually fits what you went through. This story is fictional, created for dramatic entertainment, education, and reflection, but the feeling underneath it, the particular exhaustion of being loved conditionally by people who still insist on calling it family, is real for more of us than most of us ever say out loud.